No, I wanted to have this. I'll give you a real quick backstory. I just got done working for our local news site. Just got done working at the Iowa State Fair, actually. And I ran into a guy from Jacksonville who's a huge Miami Hurricanes fan. And so I told him, I'm like, hey, we got a debate coming up tonight. So I hope he's on here watching right now. If he is, let's get it on. I think this is an interesting discussion. I did a little bit of, I wish I had more time to do more digging, but I've got some numbers here that are interesting. And I think maybe people are going to see me as not so much of a homer once I get done running through these numbers.
Well, I definitely, when I talked to Mark about the situation towards the end, I said, well, if he's talking about recently, then they got us. Now if we're talking about overall, if we're talking about at its peak, I think Miami is kind of far out and away the number one tight end producing program. But you talk about all time, I would say Iowa is definitely in the top 4 or 5. The only other programs I would put in front of it may be like Notre Dame, but Notre Dame's been playing football since way yonder.
Yeah.
But the last couple of years, last couple of tight ends, it's been really good stuff. I mean, I think it'll be in respect. You're not a Tallahassee guy, so I won't have to go back and forth with you in disrespect, and we're just taking shots at each other. You're not a Florida Gator, so I won't have to go back and forth to disrespect you in that manner either. And you're not an Ohio State Suckeye, so I don't have to worry about that part either.
But you and Mark seem to get along, right?
Well, he's the voice of college football.
That's right.
He's not just, and he went to Kent State, so it's
right.
different.
Yeah.
I'm born and raised in Miami, and I went to North Dakota State, so it's different.
There's no grudge between Kent State and Miami, Florida.
No, there's no between our alma maters of Kent State and NDSU. So
there's there's certainly a better, probably a thicker grudge between Kent State and Miami, Ohio, because they're both in the MAC, but not for Miami, Florida.
Right.
Do you mind if I share you some of these numbers that I came up? Just a quick compiling of information. So here's what I found, and I think you and I are actually. This is not going to be some mean-spirited debate because I actually think you and I are going to agree on a lot of this stuff. And this is just one criteria because that's something Mark keeps bringing up to me. Well, what's the criteria? We have to establish a common criteria, and I agree with that. So here's the deal. I thought initially, let's look at this century. So we'll start in 2000 on. That's 22 years. I think if you go further back than that, we start to look like Nebraska fans and the disillusion in Lincoln. So let's just stick from 2000 to 2022. So here's what I found out. Iowa has had 11 draft picks since 2000. And before we go on, I want to establish this. I did not look up NFL statistics and whatnot. And the reason I did not, and although those, certainly both Iowa and Miami have their claims to make as it relates to NFL production, because you look what George Kittle's doing right now. Certainly Miami with guys like Graham and Shockey, and we talk about those guys. But to me, when we're talking about tight end university, you have to look at who's producing the type of talent that scouts like, right? These scouts know what they're doing. So if they're getting drafted, I have trusted. If they end up being busts, to me, that's not the school's fault. That might be the player's fault after he leaves, right? Because I think those scouts know what they're doing. Is that a fair point?
That's an interesting take. I mean, I've had this debate more than just, I have a really good friend of mine, shout out to Mr. Rubicon. He has this big viewpoint that it's not, Jimbo Fisher's fault that every quarterback he put out in the first round absolutely sucks at the National Football League level. I think that if you can't prepare them to be successful in the National Football League, then you have to question yourself about your preparation.
Sure.
But at face value, I definitely get where you're going. Go ahead.
And I also think there's a fine line there, because if Jimbo Fisher has a reputation for doing that, that's one thing. But if a guy gets drafted, if Miami has a tight end that gets drafted in the first round in 2005 and he ends up being a bust, but all these other tight ends that were drafted then or drafted throughout the last 20 years were not busts, and that probably tells me, hey, maybe he, whether it be an injury, which is beyond his control, certainly beyond the control of the university, regardless of the situation, I think there is that argument that can be made that should be part of the criteria. But here are the numbers from 2000. Miami with 14 total draftees at tight end since 2000. Iowa with 11. Okay, so fairly close there, but Miami clear edge. Iowa with 3 first-rounders since 2000. That's since the year 2000. Miami with 5 first-rounders. So, again, an edge to Miami. And this is a number that I don't know if this is a real great – it's just kind of a quick data point that I think I thought I'd throw out there. Round average, because obviously we see those other two categories. Miami has the edge, but I think if we have a bunch of guys drafted in the 7th round and you're racking up numbers that way, then that you could argue that that's kind of skewing the final totals. Iowa is their round average for tight ends drafted since 2000, 3.818. So late 3rd round, that's the average. Miami 3.57. So again, close. Miami certainly has the edge. Now, those numbers would tell me that Miami clearly is the better producing tight end school. Now, if we're looking at recency and we're going since 2010, here are the numbers. So Miami's had just one first rounder. We know their best NFL tight ends. I think you would agree with this. Jimmy Graham, David Njoku, Chris Herndon since 2010. And Chris Herndon, I don't know, you know his numbers better than I do. Has he been great? I know he's had some expectations, but is he still with New York? I don't even know where he's at anymore.
No, he just signed with the Saints earlier this week. Funny you asked that question. He signed with the Saints. He was up here close to me with the Vikings, but he injury riddled at that time. But he was actually a pretty good tight end for the Jets. Not too much. I mean, he had one season where he topped out about 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. So he was adequate, but nothing to jump off the screen.
So those are your 3 best tight ends since 2010. Are there's any doubt about that? Because the other options, here are the other guys that Miami's had drafted since 2010. Is it Diedrich Epps?
Correct? Diedrich Epps, Clive Walford,
Richard Gordon.
Yeah, Gordon was a 7th rounder. He was a blocker kind of guy. Yeah.
And is it Brevin Jordan?
And Brevin Jordan, drafted last year. And
drafted.
It was he injury riddled too, but it was just once he was a rookie last year.
Right.
Yeah.
Iowa since 2010. Here are the guys Iowa's had drafted. I think there's no question. And that's why I think you and I probably are going to agree on this, because I think Iowa is tight end you of the last 10 years. Miami collectively, certainly tight end you from 2000 to 2010. Right. And I think collectively they still own that title. But since 2010, I think Iowa, the clear favorite. Tony Moeaki, who was a 3rd round draft pick, but was riddled with injuries, was a really good tight end in the NFL while he played and just could not stay healthy. That guy was a freak athletically. CJ Fedorowicz was a 3rd round draft pick in 2014. People may not remember him. He was a starter in Houston for quite some time. He had to retire because of concussions. And then, of course, we know George Kittle, 5th round draft pick, maybe the best tight end in the NFL now. It's arguable, but he has been sensational. TJ Hawkinson and Noah Fant, both drafted 1st round in 2019, the only time in the history of the NFL draft that 2 tight ends have been drafted in the 1st round the same year. So certainly since 2017, Iowa has been, I think, far and away the tight end. I also think Penn State, I brought up Penn State to Mark, at least as it relates to the last 5, 6, 7 years. Penn State's had their fair share. I'm trying to think. Mike Gesicki being one.
For the Dolphins. Yeah, I was going to say he's the one that jumps out to me.
Who's the other? There's a couple other guys. Let me look this up here, because you could also make a claim that they have had a claim in this. Jesse James.
Oh, yeah.
And
is he Penn State?
Yes.
I thought he was Pitt. Yeah, he's Penn State. Yeah.
And Pat Fryermuth.
I don't know who that is.
You don't know who Pat? Wow, no, it isn't Pat Fryer. Let me look up his stats, because Pat Fryermuth has been Nick Bowers. I don't know who that is. Let's see, Pat Fryermuth, NFL stats in 2021 for just last year for the Steelers, 60 catches, 497 yards, and 7 touchdowns.
Hey, shout out. I'm a Ravens fan, so I could give a crap less about that. I'm all over the place, but yeah.
So Penn State's had a good stretch as well, but I think it's clear that the schools that you brought up, Notre Dame, Miami, Iowa, USC back in the day, maybe
they were putting them out. I mean, they had some nice ones. I mean, I see the other thing I want to say in this conversation, because before I start spitting out stats and blah blah blah, are we equating what they've done in college, meaning all conference, all American, and statistics there, are we going to view them from that lens, or we're going to view them from when they transition to the NFL, their stats and their careers there? Which one do you want to go with?
I think that's the conversation and the defining that needs to occur in these types of debates, because it's so easy to say, well, this school's DBU and this school's linebacker U, and Well, what does that mean? You're right. What does that mean? Does that mean they're excelling at the college level? I hear the term tight end factory, like Iowa's a tight end factory. Is that the same thing
Right,
as tight
right.
end U? Because if we're looking at tight end factory, then I think the criteria we just ran through, personally, I believe that's the correct criteria. Because what are the best schools at developing tight ends for the next level? And that is, to me, almost, I don't say exclusively, but that should be evaluated based upon draft, upon the NFL draft. Because again, you can't project forward and look at busts and whatnot. It's how did the college program develop them for the NFL? And I think you can measure that based upon where they're picked in the draft. Now, each draft is different, so there's going to be some leeway there. But I think that's a good conversation. And I haven't looked into the numbers as far as production at tight end at Miami. Obviously, if you have a school that runs, and Iowa's tight end last year, Sam Laporta, who, by the way, will be another, I think he's probably going to be a top 3 round draft pick next year, barring some crazy thing to happen this year. I think he'll be another high draft pick for Iowa at tight end. They just run a ton of tight end passes. And I mean, he was their leading receiver last year. That's not a good thing. That's also an indictment on the wide receiver room. But my point is, like, if you're going to be more, it doesn't necessarily, just because you're more tight end friendly and your tight ends collect more stats, I don't personally think that means you have better tight ends necessarily, right? Because schools cannot run to the throw to the tight end as much, and they may still be really good blocking tight ends, because obviously, just equal to pass catching ability is the ability to block effectively.
Especially at that position. I mean, for the longest, I look at, and then the other thing is Miami is the originators for a lot of things. Okay, throwing the forwards up, running out of the smoke. Everybody runs out of the smoke now. Turnover props. We were the first ones that came out with the turnover chain, and then, well, technically Alabama had the turnover belt in 2015, and they're technically the original. But we made it cool. I mean, when Miami does something, it becomes cool. It becomes bomb, bam, let's do it. Blah blah blah. Okay, let's look at tight end. Well, up until the mid 90s, you would look at tight end as an extension of the offensive line. Okay. For God knows how many great tight ends could have been previous if they were allowed to get pop passes and out routes and seam routes, but they were basically just more athletic or lighter in the behind tackles who couldn't really get transition into offensive tackle just yet. And they just play tight end maybe early on in their career. They eat their way into playing offensive tackle and they grow from there. The reason why I bring that up is because there's been 2 positions. You could argue quarterback, but other people have done spread concepts at quarterback, BYU and things of that nature before Miami. Well, tight end and 3 technique defensive tackle were made prominent at the University of Miami from the way that we used them in the passing game and tight end, and the way that we had this 4-3 attack, because more people ran the 3-4 in the college schemes and just kind of held it down in the fronts and let linebackers scrape and move. Well, we were the ones who put in a Jerome Brown at the F3 technique defensive tackle. We had a coach who coached Jerome Brown and Russell Maryland, Cortez Kennedy. He was able to go in and walk over to Warren Sapp, who was a tight end recruit, and say, hey, I think you can come play 3 technique defensive tackle for me and be a Hall of Famer. Turns out to be that when he was an outside linebacker tight end prospect out of country, middle of the road, Florida. So here's my thing. When you talk about tight end, the position is so iffy. And I've been a fan of what you all do with them at Iowa because they're demanded to be great at both. They're not supposed to be just extensions of the offensive line that double the 5 technique up to linebacker. They blow people off the ball. Plus, they're also able to, take a kick step and you make the defensive end fly and swat them by and be wide open for a pass. And the fact that you all were able to get Fant and the other guy in the same season.
Fant is and I think Fant is the exception. I know you're not a follower, close follower of Iowa football, but if you were, you would know that in 2018, there was a lot of controversy. Noah Fant's brother was all over Twitter criticizing Iowa because Iowa wasn't playing Noah Fant very much in 2018, which seems crazy, but he's kind of that opposite style tight end. Like, I remember at one point, Kirk Ferentz, and this was a mistake, I think, from a PR standpoint, he actually referred to Noah Fant as a specialist because of his skill set. And, he is kind of just a big, physical wide receiver in a way. He's that good. He's that athletic. And George Kittle, in a way, has turned into that. But George Kittle did not produce a ton at Iowa. I will say this, too. You're talking about technique and obviously different schools running different stuff. I don't know the history of tight ends standing along the line of scrimmage, but I know Hayden Fry back in the 80s started that at Iowa. I mean, tight ends did not stand, at least at Iowa, until Hayden Fry took over. So this is obviously Iowa's only had 2 coaches in the last 40-some years, and Hayden Fry and Kirk Ferentz. But the history of tight end usage and using them heavily in the passing attack, which of course makes Iowa a more friendly program for recruits, that has been established for 40 plus years. I do want to ask you this. Best tight ends, if you had to name your top 5, and this is just totally eye test opinion, top 5 tight ends since 2000 at Miami.
Oh, okay.
On paper, let me just tell you what on paper. On paper, it appears to me that the top 5 would be Greg Olsen, number 1, Jimmy Graham, number 2, Jeremy Shockey, number 3. I don't know if we'd go Kellen Winslow. What did Bubba Franks do? This shows you how.
Bubba Franks was big time at Miami. 77 receptions, 1,038 yards in his career, and 12 touchdowns. And he had 12 in one season.
So to me, you're probably
that's the best touchdown season in Miami history.
Probably a clear top 4, and then David Njoku was a first round, so maybe he would wrap up the top 5. But we're also trying to figure out how much does NFL production tie into this. Maybe top 5 NFL tight ends from Miami.
Right. So I would say college-wise, you would have to look at, what would you seem to be the flashy? Because Kellen Winslow would arguably be the number 1 if you go off of college. I mean, he was out of this world. The man won a Mackey off of what he did his sophomore year, not necessarily what he did his junior year, because as a sophomore, his stats were out of this world. As a junior, he scored 1 touchdown. But he still won the Mackey because he had such a big name for himself as a sophomore. Well, Kellen Winslow, at his time in Miami, is the only Mackey Award winner. Had 119 receptions for 1,365 touchdowns and 1,365 yards receiving and 10 touchdowns in his career. Okay. And 8 of those came as a junior as a sophomore, when he was matched up with Jeremy Shockey. Now, if you talk about the best and most balanced tight end, you would say Kellen Winslow. Now, if you talk about one area, could catch a pass and make a guy miss, get down the field, you would have to bring up David Njoku. He might be the most athletic guy at 6'4", 240 some odd pounds, shredded muscle. I mean, he won the West Virginia game in 2016 by himself. We throw a 3rd and 8 out route to him on the short side of the field. He stiffs arm the corners, makes the linebacker miss, and beats the safety for 60 yards up the sideline. He hadn't done that all season, and we were like, who's this guy? But he was trying to put on who he could be and had 2 touchdowns, 180 yards in that game, and goes off to be a first-round draft pick. Now, the best pure run blocker, I would have to say, is Jeremy Shockey. It looked like a car crash. Like, he would slam down on 4-eye techniques or 5 techniques, and they would go flying.
He's also a good pass catcher, though, too. I mean, it wasn't
absolutely. But he wasn't a guy. He was secured hands. He wasn't a guy that you're going to throw a 60-yard bomb to like you would a Winslow and an Njoku.
Yeah.
You could even split them out wide, and they would give some corners issues. Okay. Now, Jimmy Graham, just a complete freak. Jump ball, I don't think I pick anybody else in Miami history, especially tight end, would jump ball one-on-one with Jimmy Graham. I mean, 6'8", that's not fair. And he had the route running ability to fade route you. He can go out and be an X or a Y. He didn't have to be a slot or an inline guy because his blocking was kind of iffy. So I guess that would be I would say Winslow number 1. Statistically, you would have to put Bubba Franks number 2. I would go with Olsen 3, Shockey 4, and David Njoku 5. Now, the conversation between Njoku and Graham, I think, is of conversation. But Graham only played 1 season at Miami, had 19 receptions for 100 some odd yards and 5 touchdowns because we put him in the red zone and just throw fade routes to him.
And so, to make it clear, most of your rankings here are based upon what they did at Miami, not upon what they did after they left Miami.
Correct.
So now my question is, how does that top 5 compare to, if you're just looking at the top, not collectively through, how does that top 5 compare to Dallas Clark, George Kittle, TJ Hawkinson, who's young, but I would say he's got to be there. And then what would that be? 4, Clark, Kittle, Hawkinson, that's 3, Fant, 4. Again, if we're looking at just Iowa production, and Scott Chandler's in there, who actually had a nice NFL career. Probably Moyaki after that. But again, that's a tough conversation to have when you're comparing teams in different conferences that run different offenses.
Right. Because then you could turn around and say the Iowa tight end that has 65 receptions for 800 yards and 4 touchdowns in a big I formation Big Ten conference.
Right.
How does that compare to a tight end that's going up against ACC coastal competition, which is a little bit more athletic, not necessarily smash mouth, and they may only have 30 receptions because we don't feed the tight end the ball. How about this? What's your number one tight end? Read off his stats, career stats.
At Iowa?
Right.
Well, I probably would go. I mean, I was pretty young when Dallas Clark was at Iowa. Let me find his stats. That's a good exercise. Let me see if I can find. So Dallas Clark, for his career, just played 2 years at Iowa. And his total numbers, 1,000. So 81 catches for 1,281 yards in 2 seasons, which actually isn't. I mean,
that's pretty good, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're in just 2 years, so
right. That's what I'm saying. That's not bad at all. What is that? 600 some odd yards a season. That's not bad at tight end.
Only eight touchdowns for the 2 years combined. Let me find TJ Hawkins, because he was also he's a good one to compare because he was also there for just 2 years, just played 2 years.
Because again, if we're going off of that, statistically, your number one guy wouldn't even make our top 5 stats.
Yeah, I mean that surprised me that he was Dallas wasn't higher. Hawkinson, so Hawkinson ended up with just short of 1,100 yards, 10 touchdowns on 73 receptions. Noah Fant, he was a tight end machine. So again, how much do you place on red zone efficiency? Certainly that could play into it, I guess, as well. He had 19 touchdowns and just under 1,100 yards in basically 2.5 years, 78 catches. So actually very similar to Hawkinson, what Hawkinson did in 2 years. But again, just a touchdown machine in 19 touchdowns in 2.5 seasons.
Right. Now, those 19 touchdowns would be a Miami record. But the statistic yardage-wise, now, again, like I said, we're comparing different conferences. Yardage-wise, your top 3 guys wouldn't even be in our top 5.
And so what are the I'm assuming
Let's go down the line. I'll go with you. Bubba Franks, 77 receptions. This is over 2 years. 77 receptions for 1,038 yards and 12 touchdowns in 2 seasons. That would rank 5th all-time in Miami. 6th all-time in Miami, excuse me. 5th all-time in Miami. Brevin Jordan, 105 receptions for 1,358 yards and 13 touchdowns. 4th all-time, Winslow, 1,300 yards, 1,365 yards and 9 touchdowns. That's 4th. That's yards. Olsen, 1,215 yards for 10 touchdowns. And technically, statistically, the highest in Miami, and this is somebody that didn't even make my top 5, is Clyde Walford with 1,735 yards and 14 touchdowns. So that's what I'm saying. How do you want to go with it? That's over. He only started for 3 seasons at Miami also. So.
And I would guess that in general, given Iowa's reputation running the football, even though Iowa's running game has not been consistently good under Kirk, Iowa is a very run-heavy offense. So although they produce tight ends that can catch the football, They really ask their tight ends to be able to block in the run game, and so certainly that's going to cut down on production. I'm not making an excuse for the difference in statistics, but a pass-heavy offense that already has really good tight ends, those tight ends are going to be more involved and rack up some of those numbers.
Right. And like I said, now the argument, like I said, because if we're gonna be based on my own research, statistically, Clyde Walford is the best tight end in Miami Hurricanes history. Statistically speaking, he has the most receptions, he has the most yards, and he has the most touchdowns. Clyde Walford isn't even in my top 5 as far as the contribution he had, and as far as historically at the University of Miami, but stats. And that's why I always talk about those kinds of things. I'm a film guy. Clyde Walford was a pretty good player, and he was Clyde Walford. Let's see how the NFL looked at him. He was a 3rd-round pick, 68th overall. He made no Pro Bowls, no All Pros, no All Conference, and no All Americans. But he's statistically the best tight end in Miami Hurricanes history.
Here is one that I missed. Scott Chandler was played 3 years from 2004 to 2006, 117 catches, 1,467 yards, and 10 touchdowns.
Now that's a career. I like it.
But again, Scott Chandler, I mean, I wouldn't put Scott Chandler in, and maybe that just means I'm misinformed and I'm biased towards some of these more recent guys. But Scott Chandler had a nice career in the NFL, long career in the NFL, but he was drafted in the 4th round, but he racked up a lot of numbers in 3 years. And where would that rank in the Miami numbers again? 1467?
1467 would be 2nd all-time at Miami, behind Clyde Walford.
Behind Walford. That's interesting, man. I would have never. Again, this is probably my ignorance towards some of those early 2000s teams, but that's a big number. 1467.
That's pretty dang good. And then, like I said, you got to also incorporate culture into it. Now, I know college football is going down this whole path where it's not about your geographic location, it's not about your culture, it's not about your brand of ball. It's about who's paying the biggest bucks and joining that conference. There's talks of Miami either joining the SEC, which I feel like is not good for Miami, or joining the Big Ten, which I think would be great for Miami. Joining there and playing some really good teams that'll force us to play some really good brand of football.
Tight end U versus tight end U. We just settled on the field.
Yay, wouldn't that be perfect?
Let's
just
do
line
it.
up and go at it, see what happens. But then it's like, now you want to talk about offensive line You want to talk about defensive tackle. I think Iowa's done really good there. You guys just landed the number 1 offensive tackle in the country, beat out Alabama, but he's a local Iowa guy.
He is.
But they
haven't always been able to keep him in the state. Ross Pierschbacher is a guy who ended up going to Alabama several years back and had a good career at Alabama. And I mean, so they haven't already. It is something unique that Kirk Ferentz has done these last 2 years, getting 2 5-stars from Central Iowa to stay home. That's tough to do when Alabama and the big boys,
Ohio State and Georgia come calling. And you know who the recruiter was for that offensive lineman that left Iowa to come to Bama?
For Pierschbacher?
Yeah.
Who?
Mario Cristobal.
Wow.
The funny story about that.
Wow. How do you know that? Curious. How do you know that? That's a weird fact to know. Ross Pierschbacher's recruiter was Mario Cristobal.
Listen, I've been covering the program for a while. I study a lot. A lot.
So you remember Ross Pierschbacher?
Absolutely.
Because he was a 4, like a high 4-star, I think, according to most, but like that's not like some great player in Alabama standards. Like he's a good recruit, but not according to Alabama standards. He wasn't great.
Right. Now, mainly he was brought in, and he was a guard center kind of hybrid.
Yeah.
And he started some games. He wasn't some elite prospect and had his coffee in the NFL. I don't know if he's still around, but here's the main reason why I know that story. Nick Saban talks really highly of Mario Cristobal, our current head coach. Okay. And the story that he likes to tell is that him and Mario Cristobal almost got in a car accident. Here's why. Mario Cristobal is crazy, is a very fired up guy. And They go into Iowa to recruit, and they're going to find this young man. Now, Mario Cristobal is a Cuban American, born and raised in Miami, Florida, and he's never seen snow. And he's driving.
Uh-oh.
He refused to let Coach Saban drive. He's like, "You're the head coach. I work for you. I got you." And now Nick has had his time, played at Kent State. He's coached at Michigan State. He's been in the snow before, and he understands how you're supposed to drive. Well, Coach Cristobal decides to drive in snow, and he's going like 10 miles an hour trying to get there. They're running late. And, Coach Say was like, "Man, I'm going to drive. It's all right. I'm the head coach. I know what I'm." So it's one of those funny stories he likes to tell about the fact that how tenacious and, Coach Cristobal was. But it was one of those moments where he was like, "I got the will."
And that's interesting. Some of those high-profile recruits, because, of course, Nick Saban and Kirk Ferentz coached on the same NFL staff for a time in Cleveland.
In Cleveland, correct.
And that's fascinating. Now, we'll say this as it relates to, we're kind of getting off topic, but the offensive line debate. If I'm an offensive lineman, unless I'm concerned with winning national championships, and I'm certainly not saying that shouldn't be a concern of a college kid, but unless I'm concerned with that, I think Caden Proctor made the right decision. And
I agree 1,000%, dude.
Yeah.
You're going to go first round irregardless, but it's about who's coaching you. The Iowa culture at offensive line is elite. When Coach Cristobal was up at Oregon, he had built an amazing, factory on that offensive line. Well, and Bama just spits out first rounders. That's what it is. But you're the hometown young man? Oh, man.
Well, I'll say this. I just looked up Ross Pierschbacher. He is, of course, he originally committed to Iowa. He is listed as the backup center for New York, the Jets.
Okay, so he's still in there.
Beautiful. So he's still around. Now he was drafted in the 5th round. Now I'm not saying that Iowa would have made him a first-round draft pick, right. But man, he was a highly touted kid. If he goes in the 5th round and ends up not being a starting,
I can still hear you.
A starting offensive lineman in the NFL. To me, I'm not calling him a bust, but you almost wonder, like, that's an example of. I think had he come to Iowa, one could argue that he may have been able to stick in the NFL. Again, I'm sure he's doing just fine. But I like the decision from Caden Proctor, and I think Iowa has I don't know that they compare. I'd have to look at the top schools. The tight end debate is tight end is such a unique position. It's easy to have this discussion and come up with a few schools off the top of your head. I think it would be harder to come up with an offensive line U debate because. Iowa has a claim in there. I don't probably think they're at the top. Iowa's also done a really nice job producing DBs, and I'm not trying to say that they'd have a claim there either. But Iowa, if you look at the numbers, I believe they're top 5 right now for number of NFL players on active rosters. And you're talking lists that include Bama, Clemson, like all the powers. Bama, Clemson, Ohio State, then Iowa, and then like a bunch of other powers. Iowa's really such an outlier as it relates to the NFL because it's not just one or two positions. Now, they do have some positions they just don't produce. Wide receiver is a position they don't produce. Quarterback's a position they don't produce. They don't produce NFL running backs. They've had one or two here and there, but those are those skill positions especially, and that's, of course, what holds Iowa back from being elite in college, right? You get a 5-star quarterback in, or you start producing NFL running backs like Wisconsin has done. You pair that with the tight ends and the special teams units they've had and the defenses, we're talking about an elite program. So it's such a unique program. I've been around them. I've been an Iowa fan my whole life. It's such a unique.
Are you an alum? Did you go there?
No, I did not. I did not go to, but I grew up in central Iowa, and I actually live in Ames now. So I live in Cyclone territory, but I'm an Iowa guy, and I still view it, even though I'm an Iowa guy and this is what I'm used to, I still view it as such a unique place. Like, right. There's no other school in the country that can say they've had 2 head coaches in the last 44 years. Like, that's insane. That is
the only other place you could say would be Tallahassee, but they just let go of theirs. They had Bobby Bowden and then Jimbo Fisher, but now they've had 4, so it kind of grew.
And how long was Paterno at Penn State?
100. Felt like it. I don't know off the top of my head. At least 40 years.
Yeah, because that he of course, obviously now they've had a couple guys, right? But Penn State's been pretty, I won't say
Right.
clean. That's the wrong word to use when we're talking about Penn State. Definitely the wrong word when we're talking about Penn State. But as far as not a high number of coaches, definitely Penn State would be in that conversation.
That was a good one. That was a good one.
But
I like it.
man, I appreciate you having me on. This has been enjoyable. I hope we can talk another day with Mark. I was kind of disappointed when Mark said he wasn't going to be able to make it, but I thought, you know what? This is a fun conversation, and I think we could have this debate again, measuring NFL stats, because if people want to make that a criteria, that's, I think, a different discussion.
Absolutely. And like I said, I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I got all that NFL stats already written up too. So we can go there, because then I think it flips. A bunch of the guys I had on the higher end of that list, because of their NFL production, flip, and guys that didn't really have the best NFL college careers hopped up and had great, Hall of Fame.
And George Kittle, careers. George Kittle is a perfect example of that. I mean, we're talking a late round pick and a guy who struggled to stay healthy. When he got to Iowa, he looked like he should have been in like 8th grade. Like, he was a skinny kid that, is probably, participating in Battle of the Books throughout high school. Like, he didn't look like a football player. And now he's like this WWE WrestleMania guy. So it is odd how some of these guys develop, and some of them, develop late. And you got to give work ethic a bit, that's a big part of it. But I think the culture, and you brought up the culture at the college level, that is an aspect of this as well. And I'd say stability. Like, it's going to be harder for a school that doesn't have stability with its coaching staff to be university of anything, right? Like Penn State, we brought up tight end. They've been able to stay pretty consistent. Obviously, James Franklin's been there. Seems like he's been there for 10 years now. I don't think has he been there 10 years now?
6 or 7, somewhere in there.
But it's going to be hard to
Bandy, and then he took that step when O'Brien left Penn State.
Right. It's going to be hard to consistently produce a position for the NFL if you're constantly changing coaching staffs that have different philosophies and different values.
Right. Now, the conversation, we could just go all day with this, because I love those kind of conversations. I mean, there's only one, the you, but there's plenty of other people who like to have different U's or whatever. Sure. But I look at Alabama, all this production, all these NFL first rounders, they're not even really in conversation. Like, because I guess at the end of the day, people stand out, but then it felt like under the last regime of Alabama taking over college football, not too many of their players really stand out. It's just like you could look at similar to USC, you could rip the last names off of some of those jerseys to where you don't know these young men by name, and then you would still see some of the same production and some of the same scheme wise. But what made Miami great was the way that it stood out with swag and attitude and tenacity and things of that nature. You look at Iowa, you had I know his last name is King. Is it Corey King?
Desmond
King. I mean, was he a first or a second rounder?
Oh, I think that's a good question. I know he was going to be a first rounder, and he came back, which was probably a mistake in hindsight. He came back for that 16th season. But yeah, King, Greg Maben, Josh Jackson's not been great in the NFL, but he was a really good product coming into the league.
Who was the one that caught that one-hander?
That was Jackson. That was Josh Jackson. He had 3 at a hat trick in that game, 3 picks in that game against Ohio State.
Good God.
Hey, and the other thing is, too, when you have a coach like Phil Parker, talking about stability, I mean, he's been the defensive backs coach here since Kirk took over. So, I mean, you understand why Iowa can stake a claim for DBU, because, I mean, everybody loves Phil Parker, Amari Spivey. We didn't mention him. Jovan Johnson, who was an all-conference guy. I mean,
who's the guy you guys have now?
Well, Riley Moss was the defensive back of the year last year, and I think...
Is he a corner or a safety?
He's a corner.
Okay, is he like, this is really controversial, is he like the only white corner in college football?
I mean, he's the only white corner that I know about.
It was mind-blowing. I was like, is he?
Well, here's the deal, and I'm not saying this has got nothing to do with race, and you brought this up, right?
Right.
I don't... How do I put this delicately? If anybody watches my channel, I'm a little bit nervous with the Riley Moss hype, because he was named defensive back of the year last year, largely based upon taking a lot of chances and getting a lot of picks. And those
Uh-oh.
votes, and he got burned at times. And I think those kind of got overlooked. He's got some things to prove, because if he didn't, he'd be in the league now. He opted to come back for an extra year because I think the scouts said, hey, you need an extra year. So I'm still skeptical on him. He's a good cornerback. And yeah, you're right. We don't see a lot of white corners. There was a guy years ago in the league that was a decent white corner. I think he played for the Giants. You know what I'm talking
It was
about?
like a thing. It was like
Yes.
it's 20 years or 15. Like it was, and again, having things in we're having a respectful conversation. We're not
Absolutely.
attacking either
Yeah.
or.
No.
I'm saying this because when people screen record and say blah, 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 blah,
No.
hopefully they leave this part in the video. But
Sure.
there was a dude who was he played for the Washington Giants. He went to play for the Giants.
Yeah.
Now the guy, Seahorn Giants, and he played at USC.
That's right.
Then this past year, they had the first guy who broke the mold again, and he plays for the Washington
who is that?
Commanders now. I don't know his name off the top of my head, but
Okay.
he was all over Twitter, and everybody was like, "Finally, we can get over that. That's not a joke anymore."
Yeah. We're a lack of white guys in the NFL. That we're coming
right, exactly. And like we always say, that it has nothing to do with it. We have biracial, black or white quarterbacks.
Yeah,
we got white
absolutely.
and black offensive linemen, and all kinds of stuff. So stuff has really gone past that, and thank God for it, that we've kind of gotten past that kind of.
Well, and I'll say
thinking.
this. I have no doubt Riley Moss will play in the league. I'm just skeptical that, defensive back of the year, you would think, hey, he's the defensive back of the year in the Big Ten, and he's from Iowa. He's going to be a first or second round draft pick. And I'll tell you this right now, in no way is he right now, would he go in the first or second round. He'd probably get a late flyer, maybe fourth round, but you're probably talking like fifth or sixth. So he'll play in the league, and you're right, he's still one of the few white corners in the league, but he's got some things to prove. Xavier Wampa's a 5-star safety. He's the kid that played with Caden Proctor at Southeast Polk here in Central Iowa. So he'll be a safety, likely be a safety at Iowa. And they actually have another guy who's, interesting enough, we're talking about race. Got another guy who was listed as a corner last year, and he's kind of play Iowa's hybrid linebacker safety hybrid position this year, Cooper DeJean. He's a really athletic guy who can play corner, played a little corner late in the year last year. But Phil Parker knows what he's doing in that respect. There was something else that I wanted to bring up to you, and I'm blanking on what it was. Well, hopefully we can have this conversation again, and I won't blank out.
No, it was fun for me. I was waiting, and I was like, oh man, we probably can't do it because I know you probably were sending the information to Mark, and because we didn't have each other's contact, but now we do.
Yeah.
So that's
now
no
we
problem.
do.